The Subcommittee on Oversight, Management, and Accountability will now come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the subcommittee in recess at any point. And let me start by thanking all of you for joining us today. We're here to discuss what drives people in Central America to leave their homes and migrate north to the United States. In recent weeks, we've all had the chance to visit El Paso, Texas. And like many of you did, what I saw was tragic. Unaccompanied children at our doorstep. And we are doing everything we can. We're doing the best we can to take care of these children. I had the chance to meet and speak with Yuri and Yareli, the 3 and 5-year-old girls who many of you saw on TV were thrown over the 12-foot barrier by smugglers. They were traumatized, but thank goodness they were safe. The Border Patrol officers showed me the spot where the girls were thrown over the wall. If it were not for those alert Border Patrol officers with their high-tech, long-distance night vision equipment, those girls would surely have died a horrible death in the middle of the desert. And I've heard many other stories of sexual assaults, rapes, and crimes inflicted upon these refugees, upon these children as they travel north. Separately, I also had the chance to visit a shelter in Tijuana, Mexico, a shelter for families, moms and dads with children. These were families deported summarily under Section 42 of the Health Code. I saw lots of pain, families trying to figure out what they were going to do after spending their life savings on a smuggler and left stranded from home with no resources and nowhere to turn. It's always painful to see refugees in this condition, yet this is not new. Back in 2008, I had to visit similar refugee camps for unaccompanied minors, and I have to say, the faces were different, yet the look of pain and despair was essentially the same. As a nation, we have a habit of focusing on the immediate challenges in our southern border, and rarely do we take a step back to look at the bigger picture. And so today, we are going to talk about the longstanding causes of migration and the role our country can play as a regional partner. For decades, the Northern Triangle countries of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador have struggled to combat widespread violence, political instability, corruption, and food insecurity. These longstanding problems have only been made worse by recent natural disasters, COVID-19 pandemic. Both of these factors, of course, have crippled the local economies, caused more hunger, more unemployment, and more starvation. And when you're starving, you have no choice but to head north. At the moment, President Biden is sending over $400 million to Central America in humanitarian aid to address some of the most pressing needs of the region, including emergency food. Yet money for food and shelter will not address the systemic corruption, inequality, and violence that disrupts economic activity and social growth in that region. And that's why the president has also outlined an ambitious 4-year, $4 billion plan to address these long-standing factors that drive migration from Central America to the United States. This strategy will require collaboration with regional partners to best understand the individual problems in each country and to ensure that these regional governments also have skin in the game. And as you know, Vice President Harris is spearheading this diplomatic outreach. And just last week, she met with the Guatemalan president and committed resources from her own Department of Homeland Security. And it's my understanding that DHS is working to develop partnerships with the Central American governments to develop a framework to manage migration in the region. And DHS is also advising and working closely with local officials in Central America and those countries to strengthen custom enforcement and to prevent illegally obtained wealth from exiting the country as another way to combat local government corruption. And DHS is also assisting these countries in improving security and helping them fight widespread violence from gangs and transnational criminal organizations. But this is just the start. There's so much more that needs to be done. This administration and future administrations can't do it alone. We need to activate the private sector, give them incentives to play a central role in creating good jobs, good paying jobs in Central America. And we, Congress, that's us, need to oversee progress or lack thereof in Central America. It's interesting because the only time we as an institution look in Central America is when we see smoke. And the only time Congress really acts is when there's a fire. And as a nation, we've been fighting endless wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and other parts of the world. Yet we've overlooked our own backyard, ignoring the ever-growing economic and political instability in our own hemisphere. Congress needs to send a message to the Central American leaders. We will be watching you, and we must actually watch what is going on a day-to-day basis. Understanding the failures and successes of past programs implemented in Central America is key to creating effective and meaningful change. And we've seen that with continued and targeted support, the U.S. can help Central American countries grow and be prosperous, more secure, and much more politically stable. To that end, today I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about the living conditions that push migration north from Central America and how the U.S. can most effectively help our regional partners build communities that provide hope to people without hope. And again, thank all of you today for joining us. And the chair now recognizes our ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Mayor, for an opening statement. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing today, the first of this Congress for the Oversight, Management, and Accountability Subcommittee on this important topic. I'm very excited to serve and honored to serve as ranking member of this subcommittee, and I'm sure it'll be one of many productive hearings we hold going forward to address this issue, especially relevant as we continue to deal with the fallout of the crisis at our southern border. I also want to say, Mr. Chairman, I strongly agree with your belief that we should not only be looking to regions when there is smoke. I firmly believe that we should be viewing the world not as a series of discrete problems to solve, but one in which we maintain focus, we maintain awareness, and address the challenges that will be enduring in various forms. Just a few weeks ago, I visited the border with several of our Homeland Security colleagues, including Congresswoman Harshbarger, who I believe will be joining us today, who's here with us today. I also know that Congressman Bishop has been to the border with the Judiciary Committee, so we've seen these issues and situations up close, as you, Mr. Chairman, have also seen in your recent trips to the border. This crisis exemplifies many of the problems with our current system. While the need for comprehensive immigration reform, including more effective border security, is clear, it's also important that we understand why so many individuals and families continue to make the perilous journey to our southern border. Although I believe that the current crisis has been unnecessarily caused or accelerated by misguided policies, I also understand that there are complex, interconnected sets of factors that play into the decision to leave one's country. For the Northern Triangle countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, where most migrants are coming from today who are coming across our. These factors include systemic and entrenched corruption, poverty and food insecurity, violence, and a lack of economic opportunity that often precludes them from making a better life for themselves and their families in their home countries. if we recognize the humanity of each person making this journey, often coming from a place of desperation, the need to address this current crisis and find long-term solutions becomes ever clearer. Before coming to Congress, I saw communities struggle with these kinds of crises around the world. I led disaster response operations to assist communities impacted by natural disasters, spent 2 years in Afghanistan as a conflict analyst with the aid community there, working to protect aid workers and those delivering vital assistance to others in need. To be clear, I do not fault those who seek a better life for their families, but the current administration's rhetoric and policies have also encouraged thousands of migrants to put themselves, and in many cases, their family members and young children, in danger. Many actions taken by the administration in the first days of office have helped accelerate the crisis we're seeing today, specifically halting border wall construction funded by Congress, implementing catch and release policies, eliminating the Remain in Mexico policy to deter non-meritorious claims, and canceling asylum cooperation agreements with our Central American partners that would have allowed migrants to seek asylum closer to home as those claims were adjudicated. Some of the statistics that we're seeing are heartbreaking. CBP is on track to encounter more than 2 million migrants crossing the border by the end of the year, more than 4 times the number from fiscal year 2020. Between February 19 and April 22 of this year, TSA assisted approximately 7,200 migrants at 10 border airports in document verification, bypassing standard photo ID requirements boarding domestic flights, and with unsure and unclear COVID-19 results in addition. And according to Border Patrol agents, migrants are paying smugglers on average to reach $4,000 to reach the southern border. And that, again, just complicates and emphasizes the economic burden that's being placed on individuals and the horrific conditions that they are put in this journey. I'm aware that the administration has recently announced $300 million in funding for Northern Triangle countries and has proposed a $4 billion aid package to address this instability and other issues in the region. While long-term engagement with our regional partners is important, I also know that foreign assistance must be carefully targeted, monitored, and transparent on both sides to ensure that these funds are not being wasted and are going to maximum impact to address this challenge. Without real metrics and closer collaboration between the different government agencies engaged in the region, there's little reason to believe that more money will lead to more progress. And I look forward to us talking about how to most efficiently allocate during this hearing. This kind of long-term engagement will take sustained attention and focused effort, something that we can struggle to produce at times. But I'm honored to serve on this important subcommittee so that, again, we can bring that focus, we can bring that effort, that dedication to not just viewing the world as a series of problems to solve, but challenges that we must manage, that we must maintain attention towards, and that we must be emphatic in ensuring that conditions improve. One of the key frustrations with this issue coming to Congress is while the rhetoric and conversations at the national level, we're also seeing many impacts at the local level. I'm honored to have Sheriff Hinckley from Calhoun County in my district joining us here today, where over 100 unaccompanied migrant children were recently relocated to a nonprofit facility for care. Michigan is always willing to help those who are vulnerable and in need, but we need to make sure that the unaccompanied children, the policies surrounding that, have the most appropriate oversight to ensure that humane care, appropriate conditions, and other standards are met. My witness today will be able to offer that needed local perspective, talk more about the local impacts of this crisis and immigration policies in general and what they have on states and localities. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you again for holding this hearing, and I look forward to hearing from our distinguished witnesses today. I yield back.
Members are reminded that the committees will operate according to the guidelines laid out by the chairman and ranking member in their February 3rd colloquy regarding remote procedures. And now I'd like to welcome our panel of witnesses. First, we have Ms. Shannon O'Neill. Ms. O'Neill is Vice President, Deputy Director of Studies at Nelson and David Rockefeller Senior Fellow for Latin American Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. She is an expert on Latin America, global trade, U.S.-Mexico relations, corruptions, democracy, and immigration. Our second witness is Mr. Dan Respeto, a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. Mr. Respeto created and directed the American Project. We're at the center that focuses on Latin America and the role of Hispanics in the United States, their future, and the implications for public policy. For nearly 6 years, he served as the principal advisor to President Obama on issues related to Latin America, the Caribbean, and Canada. And our third witness, Mr. Ariel Ruiz Soto, is a policy analyst at the Migratory Policy Institute. His research focuses on the impact of U.S. immigration policies and procedures on immigrants and other populations, and the interaction between U.S., Mexican, and Central American migration policies. Now, I'll have our ranking members, Mr. Mayor, introduce our final witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our final witness is Sheriff Hinckley of Calhoun County. Sheriff Hinckley has served in that role in law enforcement for 29 years. He has a distinguished background in law enforcement and has been a pivotal force in the West Michigan community to both deal with some of the local impacts of the migration crisis and of immigration in general, but also ensuring that we have inclusive, comprehensive, and humane treatment of all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the ranking member, Mr. Meyer, and without any objection, the witness's full statements will be inserted into the record. And now I'm going to ask each witness to summarize his or her statements for 5 minutes, and we will start with Ms. O'Neill. Welcome, Ms. O'Neill.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Meyer and members of the subcommittee. I'm really grateful for the invitation to talk here with you today. The number of Central Americans and Mexicans that are arriving at the U.S. southern border has been growing since April 2020. So this now over a year-long rise reflects the exacerbations of long-term chronic conditions in these nations. These are conditions that push people out of their homes, their communities, and ultimately their countries in search of safety and opportunity. To change and to dissuade this movement, the United States and others need to address some immediate acute factors, as well as longer-term structural factors that are behind this migration. And in these opening remarks, I am going to focus my time on the longer-term structural factors, and I'm going to leave the immediate ones to my colleague, Dan Restrepo. So these underlying issues driving so many people to the US border, they include things like economic devastation and hunger. They include violence and the fear of violence. They include climate change and extreme weather events. They also result from the pool of deep family ties and community ties to what is increasingly an opening and growing and vibrant US economy. Now, these are not new issues, these pull and push factors. They are not new issues for these nations, nor for their citizens. But they are vitally important in shaping the decisions of now hundreds of thousands of Central Americans and Mexicans when they're trying to decide whether or not to leave their homelands. Creating economic opportunities, improving physical safety, and helping individuals adapt to climate changes, particularly in agriculture. These are all important for altering the migration calculations of individuals, of families, and communities. And so as we think about US government programs and US government assistance, they should focus on these long-term issues and try to do just that, change the calculations of these individuals. Education is an important, and I would say the first place to start. Most Central American and Mexican young people have not yet returned to in-person school. So this leaves them on the streets where they're vulnerable to gangs or other criminal networks. It limits their ties to their communities. It limits their access to after-school programs, to tutoring, or to other efforts to help them grow into self-assured and productive adults. Longer term, education provides a different economic opportunities and different potential livelihoods for these young people. So safely reopening schools and making sure as many children as possible return to those schools after having been away for over a year. This is vital for the next generation of Central Americans and Mexicans, and frankly, for the future trajectory of the economics, of the politics, and of the migration flows from these nations. So I would focus on education. Important too are programs that are outside the classroom that can change the mindset and the direction for young people in these nations. So this should include various initiatives to mentor young people, to help them build life skills, to give them a first initial work opportunity to start building a resume, and to help them heal from trauma, because so many of them have experienced that in their nations. Studies show that these kinds of efforts can make a difference in their lives. It can help embed them and tie them to their communities at home, and it can lessen the power of the factors that drive them to migrate. Rural agricultural communities, they need support too, and different kinds of support. For families to stay and continue farming, many need the type of aid that will allow them to set up drainage systems or irrigation systems. They need assistance in moving from the crops they grow today to shifting to crops that are more weather resistant or facing the new kinds of climate changes that they now experience on a regular basis. Or they need help introducing them to new markets where they can sell their goods, or thinking about other kinds of produce or other kinds of products that have higher value margins, and so that they can actually earn more for each crop rotation that they're planting. And enabling these livelihoods in farming, allowing them to continue and in many places prosper, this too can change the migration calculations for perhaps hundreds of thousands of people in these nations. Now, complementing these programs, the US government should explicitly take on corruption that makes it so hard for so many of these people to stay in their countries. So that means reestablishing internationally funded anti-corruption bodies. It means bolstering the work of reformers in these countries. And it means the United States should provide no harbor, either personally or financially, for political officials or business leaders that engage in corruption. Let me just end on good news. The good news is the United States has real partners in the large numbers of businesses, nonprofit organizations, families, and citizens that want to make their communities and their nations better and fairer and more inclusive. They want to make their nations a place where people can stay. And so the US should work with these allies to play an important role. It should work to bring hope, to bring opportunity, and to change the realities on the ground to make it so necessary for people to leave. Thank you.
Senor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Meyer, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for your invitation to participate in today's hearing. Disruption. There's one idea I want you to take away from my testimony today, is that to break decades-long cycle of crisis response to migration in the Americas, we need to disrupt our approach. Disruption means appreciating that migration cannot be prevented and deterred, at least not over time in a manner consistent with our laws, values, and interests. Instead, it must be mitigated, managed, and ordered. Disruption requires us to look at today's topic, migration push factors, to do what Shannon just did, to distinguish between the acute causes and root causes of migration from Northern Central America, and for that matter, Southern Mexico. Making this distinction helps us understand what we can do if we want people to be able to stay in their home communities now and to relieve pressure from the US-Mexico border in the short term and over the long term to the greatest extent possible. And on acute causes, we need to start by addressing the effects of hurricanes Eta and Iota, two once-a-century storms that made landfall in Northern Central America 2 weeks and 15 miles apart in November 2020, and directly impacted 11 million people across the region, displacing nearly 1 million, and contributing to growing food insecurity for 5.5 million people. And we need to do so now. And after an anemic initial effort by the Trump administration, the Biden administration has ramped up humanitarian assistance, with Vice President Harris, as has been mentioned, last month announcing nearly $200 million for the ongoing humanitarian response. Together with Congress, the administration should invest even greater resources in emergency food assistance and in programs that put folks across the region to work rebuilding their own communities. Tapping into the desire of Central Americans to build a better future will be far more cost effective than simply ramping up enforcement at the US-Mexico border. The other acute cause of migration from Central America has been COVID-19 that has led to significant pain among some of the most economically vulnerable populations in the Western Hemisphere, while claiming 15,000 lives in the course of the last year. When it comes to COVID response, the United States is now, thankfully, in a position to help on something the region desperately needs, and that's vaccines. Guatemala, the region's largest population, has vaccinated only 0.01% of Guatemalans. Honduras hasn't done any better. They're at 0.03%. And El Salvador, which is kind of leading the way, is at 1.1% of the population vaccinated. As the Biden administration begins to share surplus, high-quality U.S. manufactured vaccines internationally, it should prioritize our near abroad, not simply as a good neighbor, but as a smart neighbor who understands that what happens in these countries, in effect, is happening in the United States, given the deep interconnections we share. People, of course, aren't on the move solely in response to acute causes. They are, as Shannon pointed out, on the move because of poverty and lack of economic opportunity, violence and insecurity, weak governance and corruption, adverse effects of the climate crisis, and the desire for family reunification, among other reasons. Effective migration management must address all these reasons. But when it comes to root causes, we need to understand that many are themselves symptoms of a deeper challenge. The uncomfortable truth is that the economies and societies of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras are in effect designed to fail broad swaths of their populations in the service of economic and political elites and increasingly organized crime. Far too many people across the region are treated in essence as export commodities by the powers that be. Unless and until we can confront that reality head on, we will simply lurch from one emergency response to the next. And that leads to my last point about disruption. We must intentionally seek to disrupt the failed status quo to empower good governance and market economics to create conditions so people can exercise the right not to have to migrate. The good news, and there is good news, as outlined in my prepared testimony and that of my colleagues, is that the United States government, the executive and Congress, working together and in partnership with local civil society, including constructive private sector players, can disrupt the failed status quo by focusing on governance, anti-corruption, transparency, and other key approaches. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify this afternoon, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Restrepo. And now I'd like to recognize Mr. Ruiz Soto to summarize his statement in 5 minutes. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Chairman Correa, Ranking Member Meyer, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today before you. My name is Ariel Ruiz Soto, and I'm a policy analyst at the Migration Policy Institute, a nonpartisan, independent research institution focused on practical and effective policy options for managing migration. Heightened levels of migrant families and children arriving at the U.S.-Mexico border are a symptom of a long-standing regional crisis in Central America, and no past U.S. policies, whether tougher or more humane, have effectively addressed the underlying root causes of migration. Thus, the Biden administration's resolve to engage with our regional partners to address these causes of irregular migration is encouraging. Economic stagnation, persistent violence and insecurity, corruption, and a multitude of other factors intersect to influence migrants' decisions to leave Central America for the United States. While some of the factors are widespread across El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, others manifest differently across and within these countries. Meeting the challenges of this crisis requires establishing a flexible, resilient regional migration management system that spans from Canada to Panama. And laying out the foundation for this type of system now can reduce the boom and bust cycles of migration and help manage overlapping crises thousands of miles south of the US-Mexico border. Addressing the root push factors of migration from Central America through investment and development is an essential pillar of this regional migration strategy and will be the focus of my remarks. But equally as important to this strategy is creating temporary labor migration pathways, building humanitarian protection, and ensuring transparent and rule-based border enforcement. Notably, the relationship between migration and development assistance is complex, and literature suggests that the reductions in outward migration take years of consistent and elevated assistance that develops broader economic and governance structures simultaneously with investment in community livelihood opportunities. As such, development is more efficient at shaping how migration occurs, promoting legal migration over illegal migration, rather than deterring migration altogether. Evidence from previous iterations of the US strategy on engagement in Central America points to some promising initiatives already underway in the region. In short term, tailored community-based assistance and development programs that focus on violence prevention and food security for at-risk populations have the most potential in addressing the root causes in the region and reduce irregular migration for some groups. Examples include job training and education programs for youth in Guatemala's Western Highlands, improving watershed management and nutrition in farms across Honduras, and community-based crime and violence prevention programs in the urban hubs in El Salvador. Through the US strategy, we have also learned about ongoing challenges, from program design to political will in Central America. Therefore, as the US government considers increasing assistance and development programs to address the root cause of migration, governments, policymakers, and program implementers should consider the next four guiding principles. 1. Assistance programs that provide financial support or skill training while simultaneously strengthening local opportunities are best positioned to lessen irregular migration flows. 2. Building in monitoring and evaluation mechanisms in the design of programs promotes sustainability and flexibility to focus on the programs that do work. 3. Adjusting country-specific withholding requirements by the State Department to disperse key types of assistance can quickly strengthen continuity and build on program results. And finally, 4. Incorporating actors of civil society and private sector in the design of these programs fosters a sense of co-responsibility and raises government accountability. Through a combination of smart development assistance and investments that support governance measures in the region, the United States can help alleviate deep-rooted economic stagnation, violence, crime, and promote local resilience to climate change in Central America. But even in the best-case scenario, development assistance alone is not enough to reduce irregular migration. Assistance programs should be considered complementary to other pillars of an effective regional migration strategy. Laying a foundation that promotes efficient and fair protection systems, legal employment pathways, and immigration enforcement-based rule of law is the best combination to promote safe, legal, and orderly migration. Finally, under this regional migration management is the responsibility of every country, and as institutional capacity improves, the region will be better equipped to respond to future changes in migration flows. With that, I conclude my testimony, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
To summarize his statements for 5 minutes. Welcome, sir. Sheriff Hinckley, welcome, sir.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Congressman Meyer and members of the subcommittee. For some, I think it may be good morning. I am Sheriff Steve Hinckley with the Calhoun County Sheriff's Office located in Marshall, Michigan. I'm pleased to testify before the subcommittee today to discuss the crisis at the southern border and how it may impact northern communities when unaccompanied children are placed in communities for temporary or long-term sheltering. On or around April 12th of this year, over 100 unaccompanied migrant children arrived at a location called Star Commonwealth, which is in Sheridan Township, and it's in Calhoun County. At this time, there was little, if any, information communicated with local officials regarding plans or the potential impact to the local communities. With already razor-thin emergency services already existing in many communities, including ours, we were extremely concerned on the burden that it may cost to local citizens. Eventually, Star Commonwealth communicated that the federal government would handle all aspects of housing needs, and there would be absolutely no impact to any local community services. Unfortunately, most of the information proved to be inaccurate, and a much deeper overhaul assessment must be considered and outlined regarding our local emergency services laws and capabilities. The Federal Protection Services have been assigned to secure the perimeter of the campus with missions including unauthorized entry and exit from the 305-acre campus. It was really critical to understand the legal role and the authority of specific law enforcement agencies, and it is impossible that the federal protection agencies can enforce state or local laws. Simply said, the property at Star Commonwealth is proprietary. It's not federal property, and it does not fall under any federal jurisdiction. So anything that happens on that campus to children, staff, or any individual occupying the campus falls under the local jurisdiction of the sheriff or the state police. To say that the local services may not be affected would be essentially impossible. Shortly after the arrival of the first unaccompanied migrant children to the campus, a meeting was established with the authorities and some clear outlines were established. The federal protection would be protecting the perimeter of the facility only, and they would not be interacting or policing any of the unaccompanied children in the facility in case there was a crisis or an emergency. All private security at the facility does not have law enforcement authority, and it was made clear that they would not be interacting or assisting during a crisis, that they would monitor and they would call 911, local law enforcement. And then Star Commonwealth indicated they did not have any plans for any type of restraint or a de-escalation team in the event there was an emergency crisis with the children. And again, they would call 911 and emergency services would respond. To summarize, it's not my intent in any way, shape, or form to take away from the humanitarian message or the role in this case. But it's to outline the importance of collaboration, communication, and most importantly, funding to local jurisdictions that are affected in these cases to build the success of all. Any type of federal actions or decisions in these regards will have an enormous impact on emergency services and place partial, if not all, the safety and security responsibilities in the lap of local authorities. I thank you, and I am humbled to sit here and to have this opportunity to testify about my experience, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Glad you accepted our opportunity to be here today, and we'll have some questions for you in a minute. I thank all the witnesses today for the testimony. I'll remind the subcommittee members that each of us will have 5 minutes to question the panel. And now I will recognize myself for 5 minutes of question. And I'm going to start out by asking Mr. Ruiz Soto, during your testimony, you talked about some good investments that we made in Central America. And you talked about some bad investments that maybe empowered corrupt individuals in Central America. Can you elaborate where you see some bad investments that maybe as a nation that we made and how we can fix that moving forward? I don't want to see American tax dollars end up in a Swiss bank account somewhere.
Thank you, Congressman. So to be clear, one of the key things that we found is that throughout the U.S. strategy for engagement in Central America, more is needed to be able to provide clear guidelines of what is working. What we have so far has pointed out to, as I mentioned in my testimony, that there's the most effective programs are those that focus on smaller local level practices. The ones that are less effective, at least have less results so far, I should say, are those that focus on the broader sort of issues that go more or less to try to create jobs without a plan on how to evaluate them. There's a lot to be said about training programs, and I think the best evidence that we found so far is for youth, especially for youth in municipalities with high migration areas. And in other parts of the countries, for example, in Honduras, less is the case, unless there's less evidence of programs that focus, for example, on tying job opportunities with some other key sectors and private sector components. That doesn't mean that these are not reliable and that we should continue to stop them. But what I'm saying here is that we should begin to evaluate them better and be able to be more flexible from one program to another. The key component here that it's also important to mention is that these programs are most effective when they have support of the local governments as well. And what we saw in El Salvador, for example, is that the smaller investments, even in security measures, were most effective at reducing violence, not just homicides, but violence, when they had the buy-in from the local governments, municipal.
So would you say, Mr. Ruiz, that we've got to have our local folks from the U.S. Embassy, folks that oversee this operation, working with the locals, with the local churches, as opposed to just dropping it in the local federal government and hope to God that it goes to the right place?
Right, that the programs are most effective when they have the local cooperation and coordination with international partners.
Thank
Now,
you very much. I'm running out of time here. So very quickly, I'm going to ask Ms. O'Neill, Mr. Estrepo. We've had spikes in the past, 2014, 2016, 2018, 2019. We've had a terrible situation in Central America back 50, 60 years. Can you make a correlation? Is there a correlation we can draw between these spikes in instability, natural disasters in Central America?
I will start, and then Dan, I'll turn to you. Yes, when there are immediate causes, acute causes, you do tend to see a spike. So we have seen both from the hurricanes as well as, I would say, COVID-19 as well. You know, the economy is being destroyed. The one thing I do want to make sure that we have on the table too is, yes, it is Central Americans coming, and that's some of the peaks that we've seen over the last decade. But it is, again, Mexicans who are starting to come, and particularly over the last 9 to 12 months, we have seen Mexicans.
Why is that?
It's many of these same reasons. It's increasing violence in that nation, the lack of economic opportunity. It's COVID-19 destroying big parts of the economy there. And it's the pull of community ties, family ties, and economic opportunity here in the United States. We're a country that we share a very long border with.
Thank you. Mr. Estrepo.
Yeah, so Congressman, in part, it is a response to kind of detonating events, right? So it's the storms that hit the region in late 2020, it's COVID, but there's also a steady state, and there's also a problem. We have, and Ariel got to this, you need a systemic, people are on the move for a bunch of different reasons, but we don't actually have a system that accommodates any of those reasons, right? We have a kind of one place, one door, one place problem, where if you're on the move because you need protection, you can't find it close to home. Or if you're looking for family reunification, there's no line to get into, there's no means of doing that legally. So you're forcing everybody to come to the US border, and we've been doing this for decades, this is not new, to claim asylum. And so that's why part of this response is addressing these acute causes, addressing these root causes, but also setting up mechanisms so people have optionality. So you can order this migration. This isn't that many people on the move if it was orderly. And if it's orderly, it can be safe, it can be humane, it can be lawful. But right now we're kind of funneling everybody to that pressure point that is the US-Mexico border in a way that simply doesn't make sense given the number of reasons people are on the move and have been over the last 30 years, really.
Thank you very much. I'm out of time, so let me now recognize our ranking member, Mr. Mayor, for 5 minutes of questions. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to build on those remarks by continuing with Mr. Restrepo. A quick question: how have we seen the shift over time between individuals crossing the border with an eye towards employment and then sending remittances back to a home country versus full-on relocation?
So we've seen a couple of different things happen over the course of the last couple of decades. One is that we've seen generally, until this past year, a decrease in Mexican migration. And Mexican migration had been largely single adults coming to work and seeking employment in the United States. What you've also seen kind of that was replaced by initially single adult Central Americans on the move for a very similar set of reasons. Over the course of the last roughly decade, a little bit less, you've seen a real increase first in unaccompanied minors, so folks that are 17 and younger coming to the United States and presenting for asylum purposes, and family units. And so I think that goes to this issue that there are a bunch of, right now you're seeing basically all of the above for the reasons discussed. The storms, COVID, family reunification, protection needs. So you have this kind of diverse group of folks who are on the move, or who are being impelled to move for a different set of reasons, but really no system that brings any order to that, right? That channels it to places. And quite frankly, having places to channel folks actually also enhances your enforcement ability, right? Because if you're enforcing, you want to be sending people somewhere rather than just saying, like, you just can't come, right? Because as we've seen over the course, again, 30 years, folks are going to come. And the question is, how do you most cost effectively, most humanely, and most effectively order those types of movements?
Thank you, Mr. Restrepo. And again, I want to thank the chairman for allowing us to also be, drawing the contrast between not only what may seem remote, and that's what's occurring in Mexico and the Northern Triangle countries, but then also how we're experiencing those kind of distant patterns, those distant trends, those distant issues, and how that's making an impact here at home as well. So I want to shift to Sheriff Hinckley. Sheriff, in your testimony, you outlined a few challenges that you have been confronting within Michigan as a result of housing immigrant children at Star Commonwealth. So this administration has opened several emergency intake sites similar to Star Commonwealth to help HHS deal with the influx of unaccompanied children coming to the southern border this year. Could you please talk a little more about these challenges and how local law enforcement, including your sheriff's department, has had to adapt in order to meet them?
Absolutely. So this, this is an interesting situation when we have children in our jurisdiction that our state law has already provided significant protection for children in our communities. So when the children are in our jurisdiction and the federal authorities, and let me start this off by saying this has been a fantastic relationship. We've had great communication, but this is a surrounding funding. When it comes back to, we were trying to make sure that all of our state law obligations were met with the children that are on the campus there. And so when there is a crisis or an emergency, local law enforcement has to be involved. And I would like to say, we initially, they had asked for a number for our community services officer to be on the campus to be plugged in. And then we eventually found out that there was absolutely no funding to make that happen. And our intent was to make sure that all of the state law guidelines were being met with the children. So we both had everyone had the same goal here for success. We just didn't have the funding to make that happen. And there were so many other things, including law enforcement and mental health and our sexual assault services investigations in the county that's going to be affected by this impact. And there's just no funding to offset it.
And Sheriff, could you speak to just your impressions? Are you witnessing? I know you've spoken positively, at least of kind of the interactions and the communication. Were you under the impression that these were kind of well-developed plans, or something that was put together a little bit more in haste? Yeah,
absolutely. It was very, very unexpected. And if we had to do this over again, I would have rather had this conversation a month out, and we were able to establish those plans and how the federal laws interact with state laws. So everything was taken care of, and it just didn't happen. It was very unexpected. And when you're in the middle of a budget cycle for your own department and you're asked to do more services and you just don't have that funding to do that, it's a crisis here at our agency. Also, trying to make sure that these are all met.
Thank you, Sheriff, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to continuing working on this, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Now I recognize Ms. Titus for 5 minutes of question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this hearing. I have a number of people from this area in my district. Many of them are TPS holders, especially from El Salvador and Honduras. So I want to ask about the impact of not keeping that TPS protection. But first, let me go to the problem of climate change. This has been mentioned by almost all the speakers, and we've certainly seen how it exacerbates the problems of poverty in this Northern Triangle. I think the statistics from the UN World Food Program showed that food insecurity just in 2020 increased from 1.6 to almost double to 3.03 million people. And so I wonder if Ms. O'Neill would just describe briefly what the immediate need for food is and what we can do to set up sustainable agriculture or infrastructure to not just give you a fish, but teach you how to fish. And can we ensure that with the corruption in government, that this will get to the people who need it?
Great, thank you, Congresswoman. Yes, climate change has hit this part of the world incredibly hard, and many of these countries have parts of their countries where there's been drought for 6, 7, or more years. So it has been incredibly difficult and leaving millions food insecure with all kinds of deleterious effects as the like. What can we do? I mean, especially given the hurricanes, given COVID, given that many of these economies have shut down, there is a direct support for food that the United States can fill in weeks, months, today. And I think that is important. So there's the short-term acute response that I think the United States should fill. There is a longer-term response, and I started mentioning that, but I do think there is these for farmers to stay on their land and keep their land and not lose their land when their crops fail. They need to change the kinds of things they grow. They need to grow them in different ways, and they need to find new markets and hopefully cut out middlemen and others so that they can earn more for each produce that they grow or each crop that they have. And so that can involve things like setting up irrigation and drainage, managing water systems differently, as Ariel had mentioned. It can mean helping farmers switch to other crops that they're not familiar with, so some technical training and the like to get to that point. And then it can be, how can you help some of these communities come together and do, fair trade coffee where they get paid much more per pound than they would today for other kinds of, there's a lot of things there. That is the teaching to fish, but it's really, these are farmers, they know how to farm, but helping them get to a different set of markets and a different set of crops that will give them much more to support their families with. And making sure that they get to keep their land, because sometimes what happens when your crop fails, you lose your land because of your debts, and then you are, you're out of that whole game, and you're looking for somewhere to go, which could be a city in Central America, or it could be the United States.
Thank you very much. Mr. Restrepo, you mentioned that ending DACA and TPS would have put additional strains on existing governments. I wonder if you and Mr. Ruiz Soto would comment on that. The House has passed the Promise Act and extended provisions for TPS holders. Many have been here for generations.
Correct.
Got the burden that this sending them back or not giving them that security puts on home governments, which adds to that push factor for other immigration. No longer would they have the remittances that are occurring now, but also they'd have more people to serve and fewer resources.
No, that's precisely right, Congresswoman. There's kind of a several kind of layers of effect, if you will, in terms of what a termination of TPS for these communities who, as you rightly point out, have now been in the United States for decades. Who are very much a part of our societies and part of our communities. So you disrupt that remittance flow. You would bring in, you have an interesting labor market effect also in the countries themselves, in that you would be sending back more skilled workers, folks who have acquired skills here in the United States, who would displace lesser skilled workers in these countries, making them more prone to migrate. So it kind of have a knock-on effect, kind of a bunch of negative knock-on effects. You'd cut a remittance flow that has allowed people to stay in place. You'd be displacing a particularly vulnerable kind of migration vulnerable segment of the population with these kind of displaced workers back into these countries. So it would be a lose-lose-lose. We would lose here in the United States because these folks are already members of our community. We would disrupt part of the economies in these countries that allows people to stay and live out their dreams in their home communities in the region. And you would displace a segment of a workforce that's already under enormous stress and make them more likely to migrate. So the determination of temporary protected status, again, is a kind of a lose-lose-lose proposition.
Thank you. That was great. That's an argument we need to make more effectively.
Thank you, Ms. Titus. And now I'd like to recognize Mr. Bishop from North Carolina for 5 minutes of question. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One thing, Mr. Restrepo, I thought I heard in your testimony, you said, I think, that the powers that be in Northern Triangle countries treat people as export commodities. Is that what I understood?
That is correct, Congressman.
If that's the case, isn't it important that American policy be decidedly organized to deter, not to enable that practice?
I think U.S. policy, and that was exactly my point, should be to disrupt that practice. And what do I mean by that? The U.S. policy should be on behalf of free market competition in these economies. These economies serve a very small number of people. There's an enormous amount of economic concentration. Those folks just build higher walls and hire more private security to protect them from their own population. There's more private security in Guatemala today than there is public security. And that should tell us a lot about that Guatemala is not really working as a society, and that those folks are the problem. So U.S. should be actively promoting market economics in these countries to give folks, Shannon was talking about it earlier, to give these farmers an opportunity to get a fair price for their goods. A farmer who gets a fair price is much likelier to stay in their country than a farmer who's working at barely subsistence levels for kind of big coffee in this case.
Right.
And those folks can just kind of be moved out of the country, less social cost, and they send back remittances.
I get the picture. Let me follow. So doesn't it seem sort of implausible? I know what you were talking about, or somebody was making reference to a $4 billion spending plan the president's talking about. Doesn't it seem so implausible if these societies and the way they've been set up, that you have this exploitation that you described? Doesn't it seem implausible that the United States, by sending in more money to these I understand you don't want to send them into the hands of the governments that you regard as corrupt.
Correct.
But that's not going to give rise to a system that suddenly becomes successful, is it?
It certainly can. It certainly can contribute. And again, it's about empowering folks. It's not that the United States is going to come in and do this. There are plenty of folks in civil society, in the private sector, in these Central American countries who want a better system, who are kind of demanding a better system. But again, the system's rigged against them. And I think if the United States comes in effectively, be it at $4 billion, or obviously the Congress gets to decide that number, but make sure you target it in the right way to disrupt these. Again, it's a small number of folks who have rigged this system. If the United States comes in on behalf of everyone else in Central America, I think absolutely the United States can make a positive difference, and that can affect migration positively, both for the region and for ourselves.
Let me say, it just seems to me more plausible that governments are formed, societies that become successful do so by their own internal decisions. I'm skeptical that you're going to get foreign countries to solve these problems for these countries. But let me talk about what's happening in the United States for a moment. Let me ask Sheriff Hinckley. The impacts you were describing were on a private campus. Are these unaccompanied minors who are being cared for? Is that who you're referring to, the 100 that arrived in Michigan?
Yes, sir.
Are you aware? Now, I understand also we have family units with small children coming in, and they're being distributed throughout the United States in a similar way. Are you aware of personally, or have you heard about any of that in your community?
I have not. Only children, sir.
You were illustrating one impact, local police resources in terms of, and you mentioned mental health services. I assume they're going to be, at some point, these children are going to move off this private campus, right?
That is my understanding, that they're going to be moved to private families somewhere in the United States.
Presumably, they'll need to be educated. They'll need health care. Do you have any information about about the capacity of the recipient families or recipient persons to meet all of their own economic needs, as well as for these unaccompanied minors?
None. No, sir.
And you're describing that their resources are constrained in the United States for public services of all these kinds, would you say?
Yes, sir, absolutely.
So if we're sending $4 billion to try to change what hasn't been done by these nations abroad, do you believe those $4 billion could be useful in the United States to try to ameliorate the problems here?
I certainly do, sir.
All right. My time's expired. Thanks, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. Now I'd like to recognize Mr. Torres of New York for 5 minutes of questions. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, it's important to note that migration is an episodic event. It's not unique to the Biden administration. There have been waves of migration in 2014 during the Obama administration, 2019 during the Trump administration, and now in 2021. So President Biden is hardly the only president to manage a wave of migration. He is the only president, however, to do so during an infectious disease outbreak, which has put unprecedented constraints on the shelter capacity of the federal government, particularly Health and Human Services. So I would hope, instead of demagoguing the issue of immigration and scapegoating the president, as too many Republicans have done, we ought to commit ourselves to seriously grappling with the root causes of episodic migration. We should ask ourselves, why are these migrants fleeing their home country? And why are they taking the treacherous journey from their home country to the US-Mexico border, My first question is to the Center for American Progress. Is it fair to say that migrants flee their home country because of instability at home?
Absolutely. Among other reasons, absolutely.
And what did the Trump administration do to address the instability driving the migration?
Very little. And one might argue they took steps that undermine stability in those countries. For example, turning a blind eye to Juan Orlando Hernandez in Honduras, stealing a presidential election several years ago, led to an immediate rise in migration thereafter, and left Honduras in the hands of somebody who's now been named and identified as an unindicted co-conspirator in successful drug prosecutions in United States Federal District Court against his brother and other Honduran kingpins.
And by contrast, what does the Biden administration propose to do to address the instability driving the migration?
A number of things to address the acute causes, so more humanitarian assistance right now to deal with food insecurity and to help put people back to work, rebuilding their communities. And then going after corruption, so anti-corruption efforts, transparency efforts, addressing gender-based violence, addressing the insecurity that affects too many people in these countries in many of the ways that myself and my colleagues here on the panel have been talking about.
And I've heard several Republicans raise questions about the efficacy of humanitarian assistance, but the humanitarian assistance has a successful track record in history. I mean, certainly the Marshall Plan was a success. Is that a fair characterization?
Absolutely.
Is it fair to say that migrants who are risking their lives on the treacherous journey are doing so because of their inability to apply for asylum from within their home countries?
Certainly, there aren't lines to get in. There aren't mechanisms for protection close enough to home, or for the other reasons that people are on the move.
All right. So you had the Central American Minors Program. That program was suspended by the Trump administration, correct?
Correct. And I think my co-panelist Ariel is more expert in the efforts to get it back up and running.
And is it? And I'll address the question to your co-panelists. Is it fair to say that the Trump administration's suspension of the Central American Minors Program is one example of how the Trump administration made the situation at the border worse for the Biden administration?
Well, it certainly really did cause a disruption for what we could do, but the program itself also from the beginning had a small number of recipients. So in future, I think one of the things that we have been looking at here is to try to increase how it is implemented so that it is able to reach a higher population.
How do we bolster the implementation of the program, the participation in the program?
Just very briefly, two quick things that can be done is one is how it's defined of who is able to petition for children. Right now, at least in the past iteration of it, it was focusing on people who could prove they were with lawful presence in the United States. That included TPS holders. But we do know that there's a significant number of other families that wouldn't be able to petition for their children. And number two, it is because the CAM allocations are actually directed to the refugee resettlement numbers. And so therefore, that would also potentially should be increased to actually increase the capacity of the people that are coming through.
Do you think the American people would want their country to close the borders to unaccompanied minors? Do you think most Americans would wish that outcome upon other people's children?
I don't think so. I think there's public opinion that has said that there should be a better way to provide humanitarian processing. And it is really trying to see, as I think Dan mentioned earlier, how can we make the process better so that people can, at the border, but also in their countries, have better access to protection systems.
And most of the migrants who are coming here have family here in the United States, correct?
There's a large segment of them that do, especially from El Salvador and from Guatemala. Honduras is a slightly different case, but certainly from Salvador.
So we should strive toward humane reunification between those migrants and their families here.
That is one example and one key, I guess, area that we've been looking at MPI, and we want to continue to do that further. So yes, definitely should be one of the pieces of the components, in addition to the regional migration strategy that I outlined earlier.
I cannot see the clock, but I'm sure my time has expired. So thank you, Mr. Chair, for.
Thank you, Mr. Torres. And now I'd like to call on Ms. Harshberger for 5 minutes of question. Welcome, ma'am.
Hey, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Meyer. You know, we all have a heart for these children. I mean, nobody wants anybody to go hungry, and nobody wants anybody to suffer persecution. But we are a country of laws, and as Representative Meyer said, we were at the border. We saw how many unaccompanied minors are there, and those children don't want to be there. And it's like me sending my son sending my grandchildren across the border by themselves, and it's terrible. There's so many factors that drive them here, but what about those people trying to get in here legally? There's push and pull factors for them as well. I guess I have some questions. You know, the Biden administration canceled the asylum cooperative agreements with Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. This is open to anyone who wants to answer. Were the agreements effective at helping these countries build up their asylum and refugee programs?
I'll take a shot at that, Congresswoman. They were not effective. So they were neither effective in kind of building out refugee and asylum programs in these countries, which is actually a very important element of creating a migration system that meets the needs of folks as close to home as possible. So the idea of doing that is an important one. The ACAs were not achieving that, nor were they particularly effective for the purpose that they were laid out. It was to redirect migrants. Only a couple hundred people were ever moved or repatriated under the ACAs. So they weren't effective in creating a more asylum and refugee capacity in the region, nor were they particularly effective for the limited use that the Trump administration put it to of redirecting people who were arriving at the US-Mexico border.
Okay.
If I could I just a quick comment is just to point out that again, one of the key components of the ACA is that I do think should be followed up, and it's part of our regional migration system plan that I suggested, is to try to increase the capacity of specific countries. But I think it does require a specific focus on which capacities are easiest to upgrade. For example, we know very little about Honduras and El Salvador. Guatemala seem to be having a particular opportunity here. And I think with significant efforts and with, again, the buy-in from the political governments there, we could begin to think of other ways that we can implement protection mechanisms. Because I think, as others have mentioned in this panel, it is important for people to have access to protection closer to home in ways that makes it easier for them to be safe.
Okay. Ms. O'Neill, do you know how much aid goes to different efforts like the agricultural programs or programs to, I guess, reduce domestic violence or curb corruption and government drug trafficking?
Mm-hmm. Well, the different programs have changed over time. So as we think about it over time, and many of them were frozen or paused in the last couple of years. So there's been very little that has gone to those programs. But when you look back at the Alliance for Prosperity, it was roughly $750 million from, I guess, 2016 to 2018. And so there were many different areas, but those were some of the areas that received, probably in tens of millions of dollars, depending on which ones. And, what we do know from some of the evaluations that are out there, and as my colleague Ariel was saying, we need to make sure evaluations are put into these programs so we see what works. Yeah. What we do know is often place-based, where you focus on one particular place and you try to deal with some of the many causes that lead to an unstable situation that has people leave, that's important. So some of this layering on, and it's also important to focus on places where you do see high migration, right? Those are the places that need more support.
Well, we absolutely need measures in place for that. And I do have one last question for Mr. Hinckley. Were you told that those unaccompanied minors were coming to your area before they got there? You weren't?
No,
so
ma'am.
You had no way. Okay, no way of knowing, and I've heard this over and over in different places, that they received these children, didn't know they were going to come. And we have colleagues in Texas that experienced the same thing. And, just like the Border Patrol, 50% of their operating budget is being used to help with snacks, help with diapers, help with formula. And we need to talk together in a bipartisan way and come up with a solution. That's just the bottom line. And I yield back, sir.
Thank you, Ms. Harshberger. Any other members that we haven't called on that I'm not seeing here? If that being the case, what I'd like to do, Mr. Mayor, is go to a second round of questions. if I may, and I'd like to go back to, question for everybody. I understand President Biden has restarted the Central American Minors Program that allows children to apply for asylum in their home country. And this is important because all of us have seen those children at the border. And Sheriff Hinckley, you've dealt with children, unaccompanied minors. There's got to be a better way to do this. And I think the way to do it is to start by being able to keep those children at home, safe, and be able to apply for asylum at home. Those young ladies that I saw that were sexually attacked on their trip, that 3 and 5-year-old girls that were thrown over the border wall inhumanely, looking for a certain death. This is just not a good way to do business. Question to all of you. How do we get this program up and running as quickly as possible? And how do we keep those kids safe in their home country? Ms. O'Neill.
I mean, a lot of the things that we've been addressing here, trying to address the acute and the long-term factors, in the long run will make those communities safer. So fewer of these kids need to apply for asylum. So that's one side, right? The other side is, can we make it possible? I mean, they're applying for asylum, they're leaving their communities because they're dangerous. And so, yes, we can set up places in those countries, in other neighborhoods or in other places within a particular country. We can set up asylum places where they can go in a neighboring country. But we can also, and we need to here in the United States, fix our own asylum system so that when they do come to the border, they're not being thrown over the border because the line is 1 million people long, but because there's actually an efficient way at our border for them to come and see a judge, to have their case adjudicated, and to go through a process. And so that will take, the resources of the United States, but it's our asylum system that we should fix.
Thank you, Mr. O'Neill. I'm running out of time here. So, Sheriff Hinckley, I'd like to ask you, your concern, and it's a valid one. You didn't get a heads up. You just got somebody saying, we got a bunch of children we want you to take care of. And that's just not good way to run an operation. There's got to be a better way of coordinating. What do you recommend we do next time? What do we tell the federal government in terms of working with our local people as well? I'm very close to my local folks here, my local sheriff, local police departments. You all want a heads up. What do we need to do?
Absolutely. This needs to be pre-planned. We need to sit down and we need to assess every community service that will be affected. And we need to decide how those affected will be funded. We need to sit down and we need to discuss how the federal law and the state law interact. They have both the same intent, but we have to be able, when this happens, we have to be able to make sure that we serve both state and federal laws. And it just brings chaos and uncertainty when there isn't pre-communication when these things are happening, and primarily funding for local services that are affected.
No unfunded mandates is what you're saying. Mr. Restrepo, how do we kickstart this Central American Minors Program at home?
The Central Minors Program, it's building out the capacity in the ways that Yen talked about earlier, in terms and who's eligible to make the claims here from the United States. That's a big piece of the puzzle. In terms of which families do we want to allow reunification to take place in. Because a lot of these kids are leaving absolutely desperate straits, but they're also in search of a parent who's already in the United States. So we need to factor that into how this gets built up. Yes.
Mr. Ripple, you bring up an important point, which Sheriff Hinckley, when I was at the border, those kids, I talked to them in their language, and they said, we're here to meet up with somebody. They all had somebody. And the fact that maybe that information was not communicated to you, I think is just a dereliction of duty. We have to make sure all this information is funneled to you so you know what the heck you're dealing with, and you can be part of the solution as opposed to trying to figure out how to put out a challenge. You can help. So, let's figure out how to help you, Sheriff, at the local level. And Ariel, in the last 20 seconds, how do we kickstart this minors program?
So it starts by trying to implement, again, the broad outlines in the processing from the countries. I think we have learned some really good opportunities in El Salvador, working with, for example, through the embassy there to try to make sure there's a better coordination of it within the embassy as well. A lot of the things that really delayed the program the last time that it was in effect was that there's a long delay between processing times and for the people to be able to come here. So if there was something that we could do to expedite the process, I think that could be beneficial for the children, but also for the parents in the process. Sending that clear messaging as well is something that's important.
Message that the program actually works and you can stay home and do it from here.
That's
Thank you very much. Ranking Member Mayer, you're up for 5 minutes, sir.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate that we're doing another round of questioning because, again, I think it's important that we continue to dive in. I want to shift slightly and just ask, well, I guess from a baseline, we talk and divide things into the push factors and the pull factors. We should hope that our country is always one that folks want to come to. We will have much bigger problems if that is ever not the case. At the same time, we have seen a degradation and a lack of functioning in our legal immigration system. And we have seen the polarization of many areas that used to be quite bipartisan or there was a consensus around. I think of border security a decade ago being a pretty bipartisan agreement, and some of that has broken down, unfortunately. So I want to ask our panelists a little bit about the impact of that pull factor, the impact of rhetoric and an expectation. How can elected officials in this country be most clear, not going far to demonization, but also offering a level set of expectations when communicating our kind of border situation and our immigration policies? And conversely, how is that what is the best way to make sure that that is received accurately so we're not creating unfounded hope or expectations within Northern Triangle countries? I'm not sure if Mr. Soto, Mr. O'Neill, or Mr. Restrepo, please.
I'll take a shot, or at least an initial shot. So I think a couple of things are important to keep in mind here, Congressman. One is that as hard as it is to believe, it's not always about us in terms of what we're saying here and how it's being heard in the regions. A lot of this movement is because of on-the-ground facts of life in the region that are independent of U.S. policy, right? And you can see that the example of just look at the last three kind of significant increases in migration. They've occurred with wildly different postures by the United States. The highest month on record at the moment is still May of 2019, when we had President Trump's kind of policies firmly in place. So it's not as often about U.S. policy, migration policy, as I think often gets kind of factored into our own debate.
That's well understood. That's obviously, there's a push and pull. We can affect more the pull than the push.
Yes. The other thing that I think is important here is how we communicate and how and misinformation play a role here. Because a lot of kind of organizing in the migratory flow and in the migratory system is done through social media and is done through, quite frankly, smugglers who create mis and disinformation to create kind of the impression that things are different than they are at the U.S.-Mexico border. I think that's very much the case right now and has been in the last few months. And so this communication that matters is taking place in channels that I think sometimes as a government, we don't really understand as well, or certainly don't really have the built-in capacity to communicate through. And then in a last point, and leave it to my fellow panelists, a lot of this communication actually doesn't even take place in Spanish, and which is another one of those things we need to get into our head. It takes place in indigenous languages, because a lot of the folks who are on the move, particularly in a country that like Guatemala, that is so fundamentally divided on racial grounds, on ethnic grounds, the most vulnerable populations are the most marginalized, and those are indigenous communities. And they're being communicated to in indigenous languages and being misinformed in indigenous languages by folks who are preying on them and preying on their desperate situation. I think that's something we all need to think more about, how we counteract that kind of information flow.
Thank you. And I want to give enough time for Ms. O'Neill or Mr. Soto if they want to chip in on that.
Just a 10-second response here. Messaging not only matters because of policy, of course, it's policy setting, but also in this case, messaging matters because it lays out the foundation for the other partners in the region to actually be able to respond quickly to what we can do. Essentially, what I'm saying here is that by focusing on what the United States is working on, you can allow and provide assistance and collaboration with, for example, Mexico and Guatemala in this case, who then can also be partners in that same messaging and harmonize those efforts.
Thank you.
The last thing I would say is messaging would help if we have a message to give them that there is another alternative besides showing up at the US-Mexico border, right? And back to Dan's point about there's only one funnel and you just put everybody there, whatever their concerns are, whatever reason they're coming. If we did have Central American Minors Program, if we did have these things, then you can message about those and lead people in different directions that's more effective all around.
Thank you, Mr. Chandler. You're back.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And now I'd like to call on Mr. Bishop for 5 minutes of questions, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope I can do this. Mr. Restrepo, I think you just said a minute ago that the peak was in May of 2019. Were you talking about illegal crossings?
A recent peak, yes, sir.
Well, I don't know if anybody can see this. I hope this works on it, but this is a chart that, you know, as CBP has done. Everybody's seen this chart, I'll bet, and it looks like it's coming up. I just went away.
Yeah.
You see it, but that shows a line, and my understanding is that the line this year, the March interceptions or apprehensions of 172,000 was the highest in 15 or 20 years based on, first of all, isn't that correct?
In terms of the number of apprehensions, absolutely. But one of the things that's happening right now that was not happening in May of 2019 is you have very high recidivism rates where you have, because of Title 42 expulsions, that 170 some odd thousand includes many of the same people on multiple occasions in a way that was not true in May of 2019. So you probably had more unique individuals in May of 2019 than you did last month.
Okay, so I hear your point on that. But also in May 2019, what's interesting is that thing looks like a mountain. It goes to the top and then it goes back down. I understand that at least based on some CNN data, they're projecting we'll see the data in a day or two, but April is going to be a little higher yet. So maybe 174,000 they were projecting. So it's going to plateau at that 20-year unprecedented, peak level. And I don't know where it goes from there, but in terms of what the response has been from the administration, the response is oriented, it seems to me, toward increasing throughput. So what they tout as a success is the reduction in the amount of time unaccompanied minors are spending in the custody of Border Patrol. And the reason that they say that's an advantage is because they're getting into the hands of ORR, Office of Refugee Resettlement. They're going to go, they've described to us plans to go from 16,000 beds on the border for unaccompanied minors to 60. They're going to turn those beds over every 24 days or so and send all those people into the United States. Is that a recipe for success?
It's a recipe with complying with U.S. law, Congressman, which I think is successful, right? If you're effectively complying with
not so much what the law is, I'm asking. You're talking about what we should be seeking to do, and it seems to me that is flirting with disaster. If the policy response from the administration is to just bring the people in illegally faster and distribute them through the United States, that can't possibly solve the problem, can it?
Sir, but you just said that people bring the people in illegally. But again, this is in compliance with the United States law. And I think the U.S. meeting its legal obligations, I think, is good governance.
Okay, so you think that's good government? That continuing that pattern and responding to it with that policy approach is good government?
I think complying with U.S. law is good government. I think doing all of the things we've been talking about to bring these numbers down in a sustainable way is also good government.
You said that most of these unaccompanied minors are coming in to join somebody in the United States. I don't know if you said it was a parent. I would assume that given the way they're coming in, presumably those parents or those families they're going to join must not be very well off, or they would be helping them come in some other way, wouldn't you think?
There is no other way, sir, and that's part of the problem, and that's part of what we're talking about. There is not a family reunification mechanism under law today for these families to utilize.
But it is true that it is an arduous and unsafe and usually cartel-dominated process by which they're coming in, right?
Absolutely. I'm not arguing that this is a good way for people to come.
If not my premise, would you agree with the conclusion that for the most part, the folks they're coming to join are not economically well off?
The people that are coming to join don't have a legal mechanism for them to come join. I don't think we can. I don't think we can. I understand, but I don't think you can pass judgment. I don't think you can. I don't think you can generalize across the board about the economic conditions of the folks that are coming to meet.
Do you know? So we don't know whether or not those people that are coming to meet are capable of providing for their needs.
I don't. As a general matter, I don't think we can answer that question.
You would agree with me that all needs that folks have for government services in the United States are not completely met, wouldn't you? Resources are constrained.
Oh, obviously, resources are constrained. Yes, sir.
So to the extent we're intensifying demands on those resources, we're worsening that strain. Fair.
While you're also expanding the tax base. Most of these folks end up paying taxes and don't get the government benefits that these taxes pay. So the economic argument here probably cuts in a different direction than the one you're assuming.
Okay. Well, fair enough. And I yield back. My time's expired.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. And now I'll call on Ms. Harshberger for another 5 minutes of questions, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the ways the Biden administration plans to address the root causes of migration is by spending another $4 billion in the region. And I guess I could ask this to Mr. Ruiz Soto. Well, sending these large amounts of aid money to the Northern Triangle companies, do anything in that corruption or improve the economic conditions there?
I'm sorry, Congresswoman. I heard most of what you said, but it was a little bit choppy for it. But I think your question was, how effective would the $4 billion be to meet the conditions of the center? So one of the key things that we've looked at, and back to your question, I think you asked in the last round, is about how much of the funding actually goes toward development assistance. I pulled it up here, and it's between fiscal year 2016 to 2019, about 40% of the funding from the United States went to development assistance. The other pieces of it were to narcotics and security, actually, and a little bit of economic support. But what I was trying to get at with my testimony is that we need to rethink how we provide U.S. Assistance so that we can try to target those programs that work most effectively. Of course, in the short run, as I mentioned, it's going to take time and it's going to take consistency across several years for this type of programs to actually have a meaningful effect for the majority of the population. But that should not prevent us from focusing on the shorter term goals for meeting the more vulnerable populations there as well. And so my answer to your question is that it will take several years, if not decades, to try to change the conditions on the ground, even with $4 billion right away.
Okay. Mr. Hinckley, I'll tell you what I've heard in my district, and that is some of these unaccompanied minors are being placed here and they can't speak English, they can't speak Spanish, they can't read Spanish, and they're put into the school systems for the teachers to take care of. And, you know, recently there was a 16-year-old put into the school system. So what that does, and you could probably address this at a state level, but it goes toward the graduation rate. You know, they have to try to incorporate them into the classrooms. So that's an added burden on the school system in these small communities. So do you see that happening where you're at in Michigan as well?
Yeah, so that is yet to be seen. And again, locally, that question has been asked. And certainly it's unanswered. And so since we are newly into this, probably less than 30 days into what's happening here, that is a question that has been posed, but we're just not certain. We have not received an answer. But certainly, if that happens, it is certainly going to affect economically and locally our communities, correct?
Yeah. And honestly, when the school superintendent asked how the children got there, they couldn't answer them. So that was a problem. And that's a track and trace program that we need in place. And Representative Meyer knows we've asked, where are these people going? You know, where are they going? How many are going there? And we couldn't get an answer. But I'll go back to Mr. Restrepo, you were talking about social media is one of the ways that of course, we know this. Social media is one of the ways they pull these people across the border. This is one of the pulls, if you want to look at it that way. And they promise them so many things, these smugglers. It is atrocious that we cannot hold these social media companies accountable. So give me some ideas. Tell me what we need to do as Congress to stop and hold these social media people accountable.
Congressman, well, telecommunications law is a little outside my expertise. But I think at a more practical level, I think at the very least, kind of regardless of what Congress decides to do in terms of how to govern or not social media platforms, I think the U.S. government needs to communicate much more effectively on those platforms in these spaces to combat the kinds of lies that are being sold to desperate people in Northern Central America and Southern Mexico. The U.S. has to be in this information battle space, if you will, in a way much more robustly than the U.S. has ever been. And quite frankly, we're not particularly well set up as a government to communicate in that way and as nimbly as we need to be able to combat these lies that these smugglers are selling folks.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things I'm constantly saying. We need to be better messengers at everything we do, period. And get your point across and make it a simple addition, not a calculus problem when we're talking to people. So
yes, ma'am. Absolutely.
I appreciate your answer, and I yield back, sir.
Thank you very much, Ms. Harshberger. And Mr. Bishop, I wanted to ask you if you would like to submit for the record your chart for the CBP chart. I have not had a chance to look at it. So
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to do that. I understand Mr. Myers got it to turn in. Thank you for the opportunity. I was about to try to interject.
Thank you very much. We're at the end of our second set of questions. I have 1,000 more questions to ask, but I will ask our ranking member if he would like to go for a third set of questions, or we can conclude this hearing today.
Mr. Chairman, I leave it in your hands, sir.
Leave it in my hands. Then what I'd like to do is conclude by saying that this is, in my opinion, a very good start to a very challenged issue. And Mr. Bishop, I listened to your comments. I think at the end of the day, this is the Western Hemisphere. This is our backyard. We've got to make sure that we're taking care of business in our own backyard. And this is going to take a discussion on both sides of the aisle, because this has to go beyond one or two administrations. And we've got to keep watching long-term, asking the tough questions of how things are governed, the economic systems in Central America, a lot of tough questions that we as Congress people maybe are not used to dealing with. But you know what? When things go wrong south of us, we feel it. And we have to begin to take ownership, not because we want to, but because it is our own strategic interest to take care of business. So that being said, Mr. Mayor, would you like to say a couple of closing statements?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for holding this hearing. I strongly agree. I think we're dealing with right now, and we've been seeking to have this represented, both the immediate consequence that we're seeing at the border, what we can be doing in the short term to address and to manage and to mitigate, but then also how we can be implementing long-term solutions. So we're not just in the process of avoiding getting distracted and then having this be a challenge that resurfaces periodically. So I appreciate your leadership in bringing together these panelists. I'm grateful for the panelists for sharing their thoughts, and to my colleagues for bringing in a variety of concerns, reflecting that immediate to short-term to long-term continuum that we must be operating on, and look forward to continuing to make sure that we are improving not only our border security, but our immigration process, and making sure that we recognize that our region is more secure, our neighborhood is more secure when our partners and countries who surround us are secure as well. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I want to thank all the witnesses for their valuable time and testimony today. And for the members for their questions. I don't know about you, but I walk away with more questions today than I walked in earlier. It means we got a lot of work to do. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask you to respond to those questions in writing expeditiously. And without objection, the committee record will be kept open for 10 days. And hearing no further business, the subcommittee stands adjourned. Thank you very much.